We're about to explore an evil like you've never known. A dark mark on this world that every parent should be educated about. In the year of 1980, the small town of Ambato, in South America's Ecuador, was trying to enjoy the popular festival of fruits and flowers. It's an event that began in the middle of the century as a way to help the locals take their minds off the horrifying devastation left behind in the wake of an earthquake that battered the area on the 5th of August in 1949. The Ambato earthquake claimed the lives of 5,000 people on that fateful day. This festival was the only thing that held the small community together. It was a source of light that illuminated the spirits of the Ambato people. It brought back an abundance of shine to the quaint, crippled town, but there was a darkness creeping in through a fragile form of innocence. A darkness that was born about a year before the earthquake on October 8th of 1948. Then roughly 30 years later, this wave of darkness would overshadow the light of the festival and rival the cruelty of the famed quake of Ambato. At the time, countless little girls between the ages of 8 and 12 were disappearing without a trace, and the 1980 celebration was something that no one could fully focus on. Parents were crying out for answers as they desperately searched for hope. One girl was sent to sell some items in order to purchase a bus ticket home. She was never seen again. It was feared that she may have been sold into slavery. She was one of the many little girls that went missing in 1980. And even though the number of missing children was growing, the police wrote them off as runaways and did little to help find the lost children of Ambato. Law enforcement released a statement claiming that one of the little girls probably ran away because she had failed at school. It was a lazy attempt to shed responsibility and shake off having to do anything to find the missing kids. It was irresponsible. It was a shame. A shame that would cost South America its weight in gold. Regardless of the cops' incompetence, the families did everything they could to find their daughters who were clearly in some kind of trouble. Then suddenly, like being sucked into a living nightmare, bodies started washing up. The bodies were some of the missing girls. They had been raped and strangled. Some of them had been choked to death so viciously that their eyes had come out of their sockets. But the nightmare wasn't over, and more innocent girls went missing. The families were no longer begging. They wanted answers, and they weren't considering, "We don't know what happened," as one of them. But with no tips, no evidence, no persons of interest, and no leads, the police could offer no explanation to the families of Ambato, who knew damn well that there was a boogeyman in the town preying off their little girls. But this was no longer a sole concern for the town of Ambato. Citizens across Ecuador started to panic because, after all, the monster could be anywhere. Ivanova Yakume was the 9-year-old daughter of a respected baker. She disappeared while fetching some food for her father on February 15, 1980. Her family believed she'd been taken for ransom, and because her father was well known in the community, the cops took his cries for help more seriously. He and his wife hung posters offering around $20,000 for any news about his daughter's whereabouts. It was around this time that a national newspaper began to cover the story of the missing girls. Then on March 8th, the little girl's body was found in a cabin on a farm. She reportedly died lying naked on an old, dirty mattress. She too had been raped and strangled. The next day, on March 9th of 1980, a stranger wandered the Ambato Plaza, selling small items like chains and locks for most of the day. Then at about 4 p.m., he approached a food vendor at the plaza named Carlina Ramon. As the man eyed up what kind of food she was serving, Carlina noticed that something else belonging to her quickly stole his attention. It was her 11-year-old daughter, Alicia. The man seemed hell-bent on getting the young girl's attention. When her mother wasn't looking, he repeatedly gestured for her to come over to him. But Alicia was cautious. She told her mother what the man was doing. This must have spooked the stranger, who began to hurry out of the plaza. But Carlina Ramon was suspicious. She knew about the girls that disappeared, and she wasn't about to let her intuition rest unserved. With the help of the other plaza vendors, she went after the stranger. And just after he exited the plaza, Carlina and her group caught him. They overpowered him before dragging him back inside. Carlina wasted no time and immediately accused him of kidnapping and murdering the dead children. But the man pleaded, explaining that he was nothing more than a humble worker with a pure heart. Yeah, the people of Ambato weren't buying it. They called the authorities and held him there until the police arrived. When the cops brought the suspicious man in for questioning, they were shocked to learn his true identity. He wasn't even a native of Ecuador. He was from Colombia, and he'd been missing since 1957 when he was just 8 years old. His mother assumed he'd been kidnapped. This story is cruel in the worst way possible, and it's heinous in almost every way. But it begs the question, are monsters born, or are they created by their environment? I'm Mr. Black, and this is the disturbing truth about making a monster, the worst child killer ever, Pedro Lopez. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born into poverty on October 8th of 1948 in Ipiales, Nariño, Colombia. When he was 5, he moved with his mother to El Espinal. His mother was a prostitute with 13 children. Pedro was her 7th. Pedro's father, Medardo Reyes, was part of Colombia's right-wing party and was killed in La Violencia, a 10-year-long civil war in Colombia that lasted from 1948 to 1958. It was a battle between the Colombian Conservative Party and the Colombian Liberal Party. It started with the assassination of a liberal presidential candidate and, well, it left the poor country riddled with crime, chaos, and bloodshed. The war is estimated to have cost Colombia around 200,000 lives. It was a horrible time and place for anyone to be born into, but it was the hand Pedro Lopez was dealt. It's believed that Pedro's dad, Medardo, had cheated on his wife with Pedro's mom, Benilde Lopez de Castenda. Pedro never met his father. His mother, Benilde, was 3 months pregnant with him when his father was killed. Benilde claimed that Pedro was a polite young boy who had aspiring dreams to be a teacher and was even known to help his brothers and sisters with their education. But it's reported that Benilde was physically abusive and her kids were exposed to sex at a very young age by way of her profession. Pedro and all of Benilde's children slept on a big bed behind a thin curtain while their mother sold herself to men to pay the bills. Pedro claims to have witnessed the men beating his mother during sex. When Pedro was caught fondling his sister's breasts, he was only 8 years old. He said his mother burned his feet with a candle and exiled the boy from the family immediately. It's reported that she drove him to the edge of town and kicked him out of the car, but he found his way home. So, she put him on a bus that took him 200 miles away. Of course, these are all Pedro's claims, Benilda claims she kept a happy home and Pedro tried to rape one of his sisters. She claims she never kicked him out. She said he simply vanished one day without a trace. She even went as far as going to a fortune teller who claimed Pedro had been kidnapped by a neighbor and taken away in a car. Either way, the result was the same. Either by his own hand or his mother's, young Pedro Lopez was forced into homelessness on the streets of Colombia. It was there that Pedro joined a gang and liked to smoke bazuco, an impure form of cocaine. Eventually, he met a man who appeared to offer him hope and compassion. With the promise of warm food and a place to stay, it seemed like good fortune had shone upon the path of the 8-year-old, and he happily accepted the man's advances. But the stranger had different intentions for Pedro. He took the 8-year-old boy to an abandoned building where he sodomized him repeatedly before dumping him off somewhere. This would obviously have a lasting effect on the disturbia of Pedro's psyche. He vowed to himself at this time to do the same thing to as many little girls as he could get his hands on. After that, the young man drifted from place to place, sleeping in alleyways and market stalls, as he searched for food and shelter on the streets. Pedro was in Bogota when an elderly American couple offered him a place to stay. He accepted their offer and later they enrolled him in a school for orphans. But then at 12 years old, a teacher at the school sexually assaulted him. So Pedro stole money from the office and ran away. A few years later, at the age of 18 or 21, Pedro was caught and arrested for stealing a car. On day 2 of his imprisonment, he was gang raped by 4 older prisoners. This was surely his breaking point, the moment when Pedro truly snapped and the monster was fully born. Instead of reporting the assault to the prison authorities, Pedro took matters into his own hands. He crafted a makeshift knife and one by one, over a 2-week period, he ended the lives of 3 of his 4 attackers. A following investigation labeled the triple murder as self-defense, and reports state that Lopez only had 2 years added to his sentence as a punishment for the crimes. No one messed with Pedro again after that, but don't start feeling too sorry for him yet. When Pedro was finally released from prison, he began stalking young girls like it was his full-time career, and by 1978, in the country of Peru alone, he had an estimated 100 victims at least, all little girls, all dead at the hands of a monster. At the time, he primarily preyed upon the children of local tribes, but eventually Pedro slipped up and was captured by the Ayachicos of northern Peru. They had caught him trying to kidnap a 9-year-old girl, and needless to say, they didn't take it lightly. Pedro was stripped and tortured for hours by the tribe, who then buried him up to his neck in sand. They had poured syrup on him and planned to let the fierce Peruvian ants slowly feast on the evil child murderer's flesh. But unfortunately, an American missionary happened to be passing in her Jeep when she noticed what was happening and intervened. She begged the tribe not to kill Pedro, and instead offered to turn him in to police. After all, it was the right thing to do. A kill for a kill wasn't very Jesus. And she was right, because it's not very Jesus. And the natives agreed. They turned Pedro over to the American, leaving him tied up in the back of her Jeep. Some reports state that the woman did indeed turn Pedro over to the police, but not wanting to waste time investigating native tribal complaints, they simply deported Pedro back to Ecuador. But in Pedro's own words, this is not what happened. He said she never approached the police, and instead, she let Pedro Lopez go free at the border of Colombia. A foolish mistake that would lead to more victims across South America. When talking about the missionary that saved him, Pedro stated that the only reason that he didn't kill her in the end was because, well, she was too old for him to be attracted to her. and so the monster of the Andes continued his reign of terror. Lopez's stalking was consistent while he traveled through Colombia and Ecuador. During this time, a huge quantity of missing young girls were being put down to slavery and traffic ring abductions. There were no suspects, no evidence, and no trace of the missing girls until a flash flood hit the town of Ambato, Ecuador in 1980. Nature had uncovered the remains of 4 little girls that had gone missing. They had been raped, tortured, and strangled. 3 days later, Pedro Lopez was subdued at the local plaza and arrested by police officers. It seemed the citizens of Ecuador could finally sleep at night. Pedro maintained his innocence while in jail, and even though they were certain of his guilt, beating and threatening the Colombian native didn't seem to work. Some reports say they devised a plan, and it's believed by some that authorities sent undercover police officer Captain Pastor Cordova Gudino Gonzalez in to pretend to be Pedro's new cellmate. Legend claims that for 27 long days, Captain Gonzalez barely slept a wink. As a matter of fact, it's believed that he kept a towel around his throat at night, fearing that Lopez would try and strangle him in his sleep. But it's said that the officer maintained his composure and made up a story that he too was a fellow rapist. And it didn't take long for Pedro to start singing. He bragged about his murders in Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia. He boasted with glee about his evil antics as Pedro spilled the beans about everything. Captain Gonzalez said the information he received was beyond his worst nightmare. Then on the 31st of July, in 1981, 33-year-old Pedro Lopez pleaded guilty to the murders of around 57 little girls. But this story conflicts with what experts claim really happened. Apparently, Captain Pastor Cordova did gain Pedro's trust, but only after offering him gifts like cigarettes, beer, chicken, and coffee. Allegedly, Cordova established a rapport with Pedro that was so strong that, oddly, it resulted in the murderer calling Cordova Papa. No matter what you believe, the fact is, Pedro Lopez told Captain Cordova everything. But at the start, the police weren't 100% convinced by Pedro's confession. Perhaps the man they had in custody was a madman raving about crimes he didn't even commit. Wouldn't be the first time. After all, he was homeless. Maybe he found prison more comfortable than the streets, and this was his attempt to find free room and board. But those suspicions quickly faded as Pedro Lopez led the police to the graves of over 50 little girls. The townspeople were so thirsty for the child killer's blood that when they brought him with them to show them where the bodies were, he had to be dressed up like a police officer for his own protection. 2 months later, in 1980, he pleaded guilty to 110 murders. Over 100 little innocent girls. Law enforcement stated that Pedro could have been charged with 350 murders, but extra trials in Peru and Colombia would have just been too complex and too expensive for Ecuador. And Pedro wasn't even sorry. As a matter of fact, he never showed any remorse at all. Once the truth was out, he was quite happy to talk about what he did and how much joy it gave him. He compared himself to spectators at a bullfight waiting to see either the bull or the matador face sudden death, which doesn't make any sense to anyone. He also said there's a divine and wonderful moment when he has his hands wrapped around a little girl's neck. He said he could look in her eyes and watch as a certain light or spark would suddenly fizzle out. He stated that the moment of death is exciting and that someday, when he gets out, he will feel that moment again. He explained that he will be happy to kill again. Pedro believes it's his mission to kill, and he relished the attention he got, never missing an opportunity to talk about his crimes on camera. After leading authorities to over 50 bodies, Pedro claimed he was tired and refused to help anymore. The coward confessed to 350 murders in total, and he was convicted and found guilty of the 110 murders that he was charged with. But Ecuador had no death penalty. It had been abolished for social reasons 100 years prior to Pedro's convictions. He would serve his time alive in prison, but the families obviously weren't amused. They offered a reward of around $25,000 for anyone who would end the life of Pedro Lopez behind bars. But Pedro was reportedly held in the center of an abandoned part of the prison on top of a mountain. He was kept there incarcerated away from other inmates for his own protection and for theirs. Pedro had spent most of his years in solitary confinement on top of that mountain, and during that time, it's reported that only one person was ever granted an interview with the monster of the Andes. A Canadian reporter named Ron Leitner described his meeting with the child murderer. Ron was searched for weapons when he entered the facility. He quietly made his way down the hall towards Pedro's cell and peeked through the bars with his camera, ready to snap a photo of the devil himself. The wall of the cell was plastered with clippings from Pedro's trial and other news reports of his heinous crimes. At that time, one of the guards let out a loud hiss to taunt the monster on the other side. Lopez responded by growling while rushing at the window and grabbing the bars. This is when Ron snapped a photo of the monster for the first time. The next day, prison director Victor Lascano introduced Pedro to Ron through the bars of the cell. Ron instinctively greeted Pedro with a handshake. Pedro seemed caught off guard. After all, it had been well over a decade since the monster had felt a human touch. Lopez stared Ron Leitner in the eyes and squeezed his hand until it went numb. Ron said the big hands were huge and powerful. They were the same hands that had squeezed the life out of so many innocent young girls. He was feeling that power, that cowardly power. Ron's fingers were in immense pain as the monster tightened his grip. The reporter was going to scream, but before he could, Pedro released his hand with a smile and granted him the permission of an interview. Lopez invited the reporter, the prison warden, and the interpreter into his cell. As they entered cell 29, several of the guards armed their pistols and monitored cautiously from the other side of the bars. Ron's fearful interpreter maintained a safe distance behind the warden. She was actually the warden's 26-year-old daughter, and she seemed to light up Pedro's desires. Lopez told the warden that he hadn't touched a woman in years, and the only way he was going to do the interview was if he would be permitted to touch the hands of the warden's daughter. Everyone who heard what he said gasped in shock. Guards raised their gun to an aim. The atmosphere was tense as the brave girl stuck out her hands in the direction of the monster. Pedro very delicately touched the tips of his fingers to her wrists. Anything could have happened, but Pedro released the warden's daughter without harm, later stating that she was too old for him. The gun stayed fixed on Pedro Lopez as he answered every question Ron Leitner asked him. By the end of his reign of terror, Pedro had built up an insatiable appetite for the torture and murder of little girls. Before he was caught, he'd been killing 2 or 3 girls a week, every week, for 3 years. He claimed he was the man of the century and that no one would ever forget him.
Supuestamente por estupro de menores de edad.
Lopez explained that he lured his young victims away by promising them gifts like mirrors or trinkets. He took them to secret hideaway places where he had already prepared their graves, sometimes right next to previous victims that he'd just buried. Sometimes they weren't even buried. Pedro also said he liked to follow tourist families and their beautiful blonde daughters. He spent many days stalking English and Scottish families. but he never laid his hands on them because their parents were too watchful and protective. He once told investigators that he preferred the girls in Ecuador because they were more gentle, trusting, and innocent than Colombian girls. Pedro would acquire his local victims by lurking around the markets of the towns looking for girls with a certain look in their faces, a look of innocence and beauty, things he wanted to steal. His victims had to be what he called good girls, usually working with their mothers. He'd stalk them for a couple of days, waiting for the poor child to be left alone. Once protective eyes were off the little girl, Lopez would swoop in and give her a trinket as a gift. He'd then talk his victims into following him to the edge of town and promise of providing her with another gift that she could present to her mother. This was the sick monster's MO for abducting children. He would keep them there with him and hold them like a loving parent until sunrise. Then at the first sight of light in the sky, he would get excited and rape them. He'd force himself on the child with his hands around her throat and then strangle her to death as the sun rose. He never killed at night. He claimed it was only good if he could see her eyes when she died. Pedro said the kill would have been wasted in the dark, so he never killed anyone at night. As a rule, he had to watch them die in the daylight. Pedro said he spent a lot of time making sure they were dead. The piece of shit called himself considerate because of this. He'd use a mirror to check and see if they were still breathing. Then he'd cut their throats or wrists to see if the blood was still pumping. If the victim was still alive, he'd finish them off. He said sometimes he'd have to kill them all over again. And he claimed they never screamed because they didn't expect anything to happen. The girls were too innocent to suspect his evil intentions. Lopez also acted out strange fantasies with the dead bodies of his victims, propping them up in graves and talking to them as if they were alive. He'd sometimes pose 3 or 4 little girls up in the same hole. He claimed his friends liked company. He said it was like having a tea party. But because his victims were dead and couldn't move, Pedro would eventually get bored and go find more little girls. When asked why he only chose young girls, he stated, "Why have old chicken when you can have young chicken?" He preyed upon innocent, naive young girls between the age of 9 and 12 when their parents neglected to keep an eye on them, even in the height of mass suspected trafficking abductions all around the area. He was evil. A cold and brutal monster indeed, but he wasn't a very bright one. Just a sadistic dumbass that stalked unwitting opportunities in search of sexual gratification. Yet at the same time, Pedro Alonso Lopez was dangerous. He was more than a monster. You'd rather your child encounter Jason or Freddy or Michael, because this son of a bitch was truly the monster you'd think the devil might find hiding under his fiery bed some night. And if there ever was an Antichrist, one might say he got sidetracked in South America. How Pedro Lopez wasn't caught earlier infuriates me to my raging core. But the rage for that's minor compared to what you're about to hear next. Hold on to your temper. In Ecuador, life in prison is not life in prison. This monster was only sentenced to 16 years inside due to Ecuadorian law. The public was outraged, but there was nothing anyone could do. Then to add insult to injury, Pedro Alonso Lopez walked free from Garcia Moreno prison on the 31st of August in 1994, after serving only 14 years behind bars. He reportedly got an early release for good behavior. If I made this shit up, you wouldn't believe me. Rumor was Pedro would be extradited to Colombia where he would face a firing squad, but sadly that never happened. He was sent back to Colombia where they attempted to try him for a 20-year-old murder, but instead of being convicted, Pedro was declared insane in 1995 and institutionalized in a psychiatric facility. And here's the next kick in the face. 3 years later, in February of 1998, Pedro Alonso Lopez, who admitted to killing 350 little girls, was declared sane and released pending a $50 bail and additional stipulations that he should continue his psychiatric treatment and report himself to police on a monthly basis. Neither of those stipulations were ever upheld. He later showed up at his elderly mother's house in El Espinal. She had pleaded with authorities to never release her son, but they had, and he was standing in her doorway. She thought Pedro was going to murder her. After all, he had stated on TV that he blamed her for every pain in his heart. Pedro instructed his trembling mother to get down on his knees so he could give her his blessing. Then he simply asked for his life inheritance, which was odd considering she was alive. Maybe he meant something left behind from his father. Either way, his mother was broke apart from a couple of dollars. She gave him those and he took her only bed and chair out to sell it to some people on the street. And then Pedro Lopez vanished. This story is so disturbing that I don't think my brain can fully comprehend the gravity of the crimes that happened here. I genuinely cannot fathom what this individual did to so many. Did the atmosphere around Pedro Lopez turn his innocence into a cluster B nightmare? Maybe. Probably. If so, is it fair or his fault that he was branded with a violent personality disorder? Absolutely not. But I maintain the same ground I hold when dealing with any monster I cover. Once you transfer your pain onto the surface of someone else's life for your own sick pleasure, I stop feeling for you. I transfer my empathy and sympathy tenfold to the victim or victims you obliterated, and I have about as little remorse for your suffering as you had for those you inflicted your horror onto. I hope someone recognized Pedro and finished off what the natives in Peru didn't get to do with the ants. I hope he suffered and died cold and alone in the night before the sunrise. And if he is still alive, well, I doubt there's even any light left to slip from the eyes of this monster. And as for those who created this cult, all of the above applies to them too, including his mother if what Pedro said is true. 350 little girls? What the fuck? This guy has a whole graveyard of little children. This was so fucking preventable. Parents, keep an eye on your children, especially young ones. It's your job to know where they are at all times, so check on them. Tell them about people like Pedro. Maybe not every detail. I mean, like, don't show them this video, but don't bubble wrap the planet in exchange for their safety. Make them aware. I mean, stranger danger sounds cute, but is it effective? Find something in between that works, so our kids stay safe. Where I come from, we were told true stories like the West Memphis 3 or Morgan Nick. And you know what? Knowing the truth helped keep us safe. That's why they got you. You are the adult. And while you can't keep your eye on them 24/7, you can know where they are, and you can keep them educated in a way that suits their fragile mind. Besides, you never want to be in a position where you have to figure out what photo to put up on the poster. Let's keep our kids off the milk cartons. I'm Mr. Black, and this is the disturbing truth